So in this video we're going to cover the skinning process, or the process of binding a mesh to follow the underlying hierarchy of bones, or the skeleton. If you open up the start scene, you will notice that we have a scene that consists out of bones that have already been created, like an internal skeleton for the arm, and we have an arm itself, the mesh itself. If you scrub the timeline, you will see, So if you start scrubbing the timeline, you will see that there is an animation in there, and it just goes through a series of motion where each of the limbs is bending and basically covering a basic range of motions. And this type of animation is extremely important for the skinning process because it saves incredible amount of time, and it at the same time it offers much better end results for skinning. And as such, it's called range of motions, and the whole idea is that you put through the range of motions each of the limbs so that you can clearly see what's going on in any given position. Now that we know what we have in our scene, let's see how do we go about binding this mesh to the skeleton, because as you can see, the skeleton moves but the mesh is not following. That's what the skinning is for. So in 3dsMax, skin is a modifier. So as such, you will select your object that you want to apply the skin for, and then you go to modify. You can just type skin, and you can just use the skin modifier here, and it has been added. So by default, even though it has been added, it's not doing anything. The reason for that is that if you look at this list of bones, there are no bones in it by default. So we have to, the first thing that we have to do is click on this bones add button and select the bones that we want to influence our mesh. Here it becomes extremely apparent why it's good to organize your scenes in 3dsMax into layers, because if I just went into here and then select it, it would be very time consuming to expand everything, select everything. If I have layers and I've already placed all of my bone objects in the layer called bones, all I need to do is expand that layer, click Shift select all the objects in there, and then make a little bit of an adjustment of which bones I want to affect and drive this mesh. I don't want all of them. In this case, you see these little bones here at the end of fingers, they don't affect the mesh. They're actually outside of the mesh, but they are needed for controlling the fingers. But for our purposes, for the skin, we don't need them. So I'm going to control click and remove them from the selection for all of the 5 fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All 5 fingertips, I don't need them. The rest of the bones I do need. So I'm going to select, and now we have our bones added into the skin modifier. By default, now it will have some behavior, but similar to Maya and every other package, it's going to be very wonky, and there's going to be a lot of errors going on. So not really great starting point by default. And previously, skinning process was extremely tedious because you had extremely limited tools to work with, but thankfully recently there has been an introduction of extremely powerful solvers and tools that make the skinning process now a breeze, which is an excellent thing. So let's see how do we go about actually creating a really good starting point for our skinning process. So we have added our bones. The very first thing I want you to do is to go into the display section of skin modifier, and under the display find the button show no envelopes. So by default, you will be seeing these envelopes and they will be selectable. This is the old method of skinning, which is completely obsolete now and should not be used. And basically, all you want to do is just click show no envelopes so that they are not there. Next thing you need is to enable vertices so that you can individually select vertices at some point. And now your skin modifier is set up for working. Now, where does the secret lie? Well, indeed, in 3dsMax it is a little bit of a secret if you don't know. The main tool, or main two tools that you will be working with, are right here under weight properties, weight solver, where it says voxel and these three dots here. You can choose between voxel and heat map solver, and they are exactly the same like in Maya, and their use is they will create a really good and high quality starting point that still needs some tweaking and some work, but it's an extremely good starting point. They do similar things, but their use is a little bit different. Heat map is used for more rigid and more separate types of solutions, and voxel is used for more organic and more bendy and more blended and softer type of a look. So we will just start with the voxel solver, and I'm gonna click on these three dots here. This opens up your solver, weight solver menu. And basically you have fall off, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Smaller the fall off, smoother the results. Stronger the fall off, more rigid the results. So in our case, since we want it to be a little bit fairly rigid, let's put it to 0.75. Maximum influence is the maximum number of bones that can influence a single vertex. Now for this section here, 2 would be fine, but here, for example, we have 3 or 4, and here we will also have maybe 3. So it's a good idea to actually give it some leeway and some room so that it can distribute the weights over. So even though technically we need the maximum of 3, you get a little bit better and smoother results if you give it a tiny bit more. So in this case, I'm just going to go for 5. Maximum resolution is the resolution, or the how precise the solver will be. Obviously, more precise the results, but precision is not necessarily better, and it really depends on the topology and the structure of your mesh. And also be extremely careful when using maximum resolution and winding numbers. Those are all precision things. It's going to be very much okay on this model because it's small and it's really low poly, but if you're working with an extremely high poly model and you set these settings, or even crazier like this, then that's going to take a considerable amount of time, and it might turn into hours. So do not underestimate how much time it will take. It's actually quite a demanding process, so you should use the adequate amount of resolution, not just bump it up to the max and go. So in this case, low poly, I'm just going to use higher resolution here, and I'm going to hit apply. At the bottom it was doing its thing, and now we have a solution that has been done. So we can actually now scrub, and we can see that we have a much better elbow, really good shoulder, okay wrist, and the fingers are pretty much on spot and perfect, especially the thumb. It's actually deforming the rest of the hand very nicely, which is usually extremely difficult and painful to do by hand. So next we need to address the points that are a little bit problematic. So we can see that this elbow, even though it's okay, it's way too rubbery because there's quite a lot of bone there, and it should be far more rigid. And especially the wrist here, it's tugging and pulling way too much on these vertices here. And that's something that I want to address, because we get this bend here, which is really not something that we want. So in Max, you can certainly use the manual weight assignment, which is quite useful for final tweaking, but I'm going to use that in the very end. My usual workflow and the recommended workflow is to actually now just apply different settings of the different solvers for specific selections, and that's something that you can do in Max, which is really powerful. So I'm going to switch to top view, and I'm going to use a tool marquee selection. I'm going to switch it to a draw selection. So what that means is that I can click and draw a selection. Why is that useful? Well, because as we've defined, this is the problematic area here. So I want to influence and I want to modify these vertices around here. And since I'm in vertex mode, I'm able to actually select vertices. So I'm just going to start that selection like that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and then I'm going to just refine the selection to make sure that the whole loop is selected. So by holding Control, I'm simply going to add vertices to the selection set that I have made. And this is okay. I'm just going to add a little bit here, and the rest of it seems good. Yeah, so I have the correct selection of vertices. Now what's going to happen is when I apply a solver, it will be applied only to these selected vertices, not to the entire mesh. This is incredibly powerful because that means that I can now, let's say, go to this frame, and you see how rubbery this elbow is. Now I can switch to heat map because, as you remember, I mentioned that heat map is used for more rigid types of solutions. So I'm gonna apply a fairly rigid type of a solution with a maximum influence of 2. I don't want any other bones other than these two to affect these vertices here. So I'm just gonna hit apply and wait, because heat map takes quite a bit of time, and you can see that we have a much more rigid solution. However, now it's a little bit too rigid. So I'm just gonna change the settings maybe down to 0.6, apply, wait, and done. And now we have very, very well defined elbow and some movement, but not too much. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm gonna actually use the exact same technique and just apply it to the wrist itself. So let's now create a selection and define which bones do I want to affect. So I want to affect basically all from here and all the way back there, I think. Let's see. Yes. Well, we can actually go... yeah, we can go even further back. No, let's just affect it here and down to there. Alright, so now that I have my selection, I define where the frame is that I'm going to use as a reference to see if it's good or not. So I'm going to switch to perspective by pressing letter P. I'm going to repeat the same procedure that we did for the elbow. So I'm just going to use heat map. I'm going to click on the 3 dots, and I'm going to use, let's use the same value. It worked nicely on the elbow, and I'm going to use max influence 2, hit apply, wait, and let's see what we get. Okay, this is a little bit too rigid. You can see how these two are going way in. So heat map by default is quite rigid, and I know by experience that I want this a little bit more softer, and actually for heat map solver and this particular situation, the value of 0.1 is actually going to give me a nicer, smoother result that I am looking for, which is exactly here. And that's exactly what we're getting now. So we have a nice bend of the wrist itself without tugging too much on the relying on the other vertices. Our fingers were good to begin with, which is excellent. The thumb is good. The twist of the arm works. And now there's only one thing that I'd like to show you. Because we've used 5 bone influence originally in the voxel solver, we have this situation where the hand bone has like a completely almost minuscule influence on these vertices here, and that's not something I want. There's no need for it to be there, and I'm just gonna select all of it. So yeah, that's pretty much that. And now I'm gonna use this weight tool here. It looks like a spanner. You'll click on it, it will open up, and this is a weight tool for manual assignment of vertices. Basically what it does is lets you manually assign and change the weight of vertices, and it's really good for super fine tuning when you need it to. In this case, you can shrink, grow selection, you can do like normal edit poly operations for selecting vertices, but more importantly you have these shortcuts for assigning weight, which is 0, 0.1, 25, 5, 75, 9, or full 1. And you have other options as well, but in this case, since we're just simply gonna adjust it a little, and I want to reduce and completely eliminate any influence of this hand bone that I have selected from these vertices here, I'm just gonna simply click on 0, and I have removed the influence from that bone. So I'm gonna double check all these things. Yeah, that's okay. Shoulder effects fine. So that's pretty much it. And now when I exit the skin modifier, and if we check our final results, we get a rigid bend in the elbow, and we get very nice movement overall, and in a very short amount of time with very, very little manual labor. So that's pretty much that.